In many ways, there is something analogous to the protests which reliably became riots that were taking place in Portland almost every night for well over half a year, and in other cities as well, with some less regularity. In that, there are, the treatment obviously from the media of these two sets of events is wildly different. But in both cases, it is not a single uniform group. And so just as people on the right decrying every single person who went out into the streets to support Black Lives Matter were wrong to do so, because this was not a single uniform force, and not by far the vast majority of people who were protesting on the streets in Portland, for instance, and elsewhere, did not become rioters. But a reliable portion of people almost every night did. And it sounds like, I don't know what the ratios are, we may never know, but just as there was some rally that included a wide variety of people, most of whom had no intention of and would not have gotten wrapped up into what you're calling an insurrection, a siege on the Capitol, but that doesn't mean that some small proportion of people didn't do that. And in both cases, the rioting, whether or not it's on a federal building in downtown Portland or the actual Capitol building in Washington, D.C., is totally unacceptable.
Oh, completely unacceptable. Now, one does have to deal with, and I talked about this on the Trigonometry podcast, one does have to deal with the fact that the United States was born in an insurrection. Mm-hmm. And so there is an acknowledgement in our foundational principles that there are events that call for something well beyond civil disobedience.
In fact, can we just show very quickly here, Zach, my screen, Wall Street Journal op-ed from 3 days ago, actually from a former Princeton fellow as well, Aaron Zubia, called The Founder's Guide to Knock Down, Drag Out Fighting. The subheadline here being the ratification debates of 1787-88 were colored by, quote, patriotic enthusiasms verging on violent chaos. Again, not a justification, just an historical correction of sorts, that our rosy image of history, as if the U.S. was born, sort of Aphrodite-like on the half shell, and everyone was thrilled with it, is certainly not true.
Yeah, certainly not true. But, so I will say this whole conversation takes place with a certain amount of, I'm tempted to say trepidation, but let's just call it fear. Mm-hmm. There's a certain amount of fear that what is taking place on the major platforms is coming for us, and that the important points that we are trying to make will not only be lost, but that our attempting to make them may hasten what will likely come for us. Not for the first time, so we will come back to this. But in any case, I want to somehow make this point, and to the extent that DarkHorse might disappear from this platform, I want you to remember that I made it. Okay? And the point is, you have a lot of people responding to a garbagey understanding of what is taking place, right? You have the QAnon right, which has a misunderstanding about where we are. Not that I don't know almost anything about the detail of the content of QAnon, but it's an overly packaged view of what has gone wrong. It has filled a vacuum of information about what really runs society. This is, again, the counterpart of the confused understanding over on the BLM, Antifa, Black Bloc left, right? Which has the sense that our civilization is so evil and so far above others with respect to how much harm it has done, that the only response to it is to tear down its structures, right? That cannot possibly make things worse and will inevitably make things better. That is an equally confused understanding of where we are. And so you cannot have a society in which every individual gets to decide for themselves when you have reached a moment that you are obligated to rebel against the structures and tear them down, right? You can't have everybody waking up each morning and deciding whether they're in a Unabomber mood or not, right? So to the extent that the founders of the country rebelled against a tyrannical governance structure, they were very clear-headed on why they were doing it, and they were united, and it was clearly justified. And what we have here is a small insurrection into the Capitol that is somehow the fringe, I mean, it's almost physically the fringe of this much larger protest that was at the Capitol, which is itself the fringe of the conservative movement, right? So anyway, you've got these things, it's like a physical gradient, and you've got people who are, wearing the Viking helmets and carrying the Confederate flags, breaching the Capitol. That's obviously completely unacceptable, and it is an insurrection, even according to many of them, right? You'll see this in what they say into cameras. However, I think it is also incumbent on us to recognize there are some I know nothing about the improvised explosive devices that we are told were found at the Capitol. I did see an image of somebody who appeared to be a protester who had zip ties of the kind you would use to bind somebody's hands. These are very troubling facts, as are the Confederate flag, the Camp Auschwitz T-shirt. These are hallmarks of something completely out of control. On the other hand, completely unhinged. On the other hand, what I didn't see, these are right-wingers. Were any of them armed? I assume they must have been. But one did not see a lot of firearms in this circumstance. So what you have is an insurrection, an egregious violation of the law, one that is not justified by our circumstances, but done in a way that is clearly intended to be, in some sense, symbolic, right? So I'm not justifying it, but what I'm saying is that an honest broker would have to parse all of this nuance, and that unfortunately what we are getting, this idea that we can decide who's right enough to listen to, that we can take anybody who is engaging any idea that has been formally dismissed and toss them off platforms and things, is going to result in the worsening of the problem that caused the rioting this summer, and the worsening of the problem that caused the breach of the Capitol, which is people don't have good information to go on. Why don't they have good information to go on? Lots of different reasons, including mundane algorithm stuff. But the point is, this is what happens in the vacuum of analysis, is you get this kind of confusion. You get QAnon confusion on the one side and Antifa confusion on the other side. And if you want this not to characterize the way we are going forward, the thing to do is not to try to police speech online. That's a perfectly insane response to this. It's going to make it worse. The right thing to do is to let those of us who know how to engage these difficult questions responsibly do it. Will we make errors? Of course, but that's the nature of civilization.